The humid air of the small, dimly lit apartment felt suffocating, yet Clara couldn't bring herself to open the windows. It wasn't just the weather that weighed on her. It was the unbearable sense of failure that loomed over her every waking moment. The stack of unpaid bills on the chipped kitchen counter seemed to mock her, a grim reminder that her world revolved around numbers she couldn't control. Money. It was the thing that ruled her life, or rather, the glaring absence of it. No matter how hard she worked, how many shifts she took, the gaps in her finances only grew wider. Her mother coughed softly from the next room, a sound that tore through Clara's chest like a jagged blade. The doctor's words echoed in her mind. Chronic, treatable but expensive. The word expensive hung there like an invisible chain, tethering Clara to a life of endless sacrifice. She clutched the armrest of the battered sofa, staring at the worn fabric as though it might hold some secret to escape. The weight of her situation pressed her into the cushions, yet her mind raced, desperate for a solution. It was then she saw the flyer. Folded and crumpled, it sat at the edge of the table, half buried under an old newspaper. Entrepreneurship Mentorship Program, it read in bold letters, promising guidance from some of the city's wealthiest business leaders. A spark of hope flickered in her chest, fragile but undeniable. This was her chance to learn, to grow, to claw her way out of the suffocating pit she'd been thrown into. She grabbed the flyer, smoothing out its creases as though it were her lifeline. 2 weeks later, Clara found herself in a towering glass building, surrounded by people who exuded confidence and privilege. Every detail of the space screamed wealth, from the polished marble floors to the scent of leather and mahogany that hung in the air. She clutched her modest folder containing her handwritten business proposal, feeling small and out of place. But she had worked tirelessly on this idea, a community-focused food business that could grow into something meaningful, something sustainable. It was her way out, and she had to make them see it. As her turn approached, the sharp, dismissive eyes of the panel bore into her. Their tailored suits and glinting watches were a stark contrast to Clara's simple blouse and scuffed shoes. When she began her pitch, her voice trembled, betraying her nervousness. She spoke of her vision, weaving her personal struggles into her narrative to show her determination. But as she spoke, she saw the smirks, the exchanged glances, the barely concealed yawns. One man interrupted her mid-sentence, his voice cold and cutting. "It's a noble idea, but let's be realistic. Businesses require capital, connections, and a certain level of sophistication. It's not feasible. Maybe focus on finding a steady job instead." Laughter rippled through the room, and Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. They didn't just reject her idea, they dismissed her as a person, as though her dreams were a waste of their time. Her hands trembled as she collected her things, avoiding eye contact with the others in the room. The harsh words echoed in her mind as she stumbled out onto the street, blinking back tears. She felt crushed, but a flicker of defiance ignited within her. That cold rejection didn't extinguish her hope, it fueled her determination. If they couldn't see her potential, she would show them. The fire inside her, though faint, was now unquenchable. If you've ever been underestimated or dismissed, you know that feeling, the ache of being ignored, yet the burning resolve to prove everyone wrong. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Does Clara's struggle remind you of someone you know? Perhaps even yourself? Your voice matters here. As the evening sun dipped below the skyline, Clara's thoughts shifted. She didn't know how, but she would make her vision a reality. Somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning of her story. The city felt different at night, as though it held secrets too heavy for the daylight. Clara walked aimlessly along the narrow streets, her hands buried in the pockets of her worn coat. The cold stung her cheeks, but it couldn't compare to the hollow ache in her chest. The humiliation of the mentorship event still clung to her like a second skin, a constant reminder that to those people, she was insignificant. The words, "not feasible," repeated in her mind like a cruel mantra, each syllable tearing at her confidence. She stopped in front of a small cafe, its golden lights spilling out onto the pavement. The place smelled of coffee and freshly baked bread, comforting scents that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. Hesitantly, Clara stepped in, her meager finances urging her to simply warm up rather than spend on anything indulgent. She chose a corner seat near the window, where she could watch the city's rhythm unfold in quiet reflection. It was then that she noticed him. Sitting 2 tables away, a man with a calm, composed demeanor was writing in a leather notebook. He was neatly dressed but not ostentatious, with an air of quiet confidence that seemed out of place in such a modest cafe. Clara didn't realize she had been staring until he looked up and met her gaze. Embarrassed, she quickly turned her eyes back to the street, her face flushing. "You look like someone with a lot on her mind," he said, his voice smooth but sincere. Clara glanced back, startled. He was smiling faintly, not in the smug way she'd seen so often at the mentorship event, but in a way that felt genuine. Against her better judgment, she responded, "Just a tough day," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He gestured toward the empty chair at his table. "Sometimes it helps to talk. I'm Raphael, by the way." There was a warmth in his tone that disarmed her. Hesitantly, Clara moved to his table, feeling an odd sense of relief. Over the next hour, she found herself pouring out her frustrations, her dreams, and the brutal rejection she had faced earlier that day. Raphael listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When she finally stopped, her throat dry from talking, she felt strangely lighter. "Your idea has merit," he said after a moment, "but it's clear they weren't ready to hear it. That doesn't mean it's impossible." Clara scoffed, her fingers toying with the edge of her cup. "Easy for you to say. You don't know what it's like to be dismissed just because you don't have money or connections." Raphael leaned back, studying her. "You're right. I don't know your exact struggle, but I know what it's like to be underestimated. And I know that sometimes the key to success isn't just about money or connections, it's about persistence. Most people quit before they even get close to achieving something great." His words hung in the air, resonating with something deep inside her. Despite her initial skepticism, Clara couldn't ignore the spark of hope his encouragement had reignited. He slid a napkin across the table toward her, on which he had written an address and a time. "Meet me here tomorrow," he said. "I want to show you something." Clara hesitated, her instincts urging her to be cautious, but there was something in his demeanor, an honesty that made her want to trust him. She tucked the napkin into her coat pocket, giving him a small nod before excusing herself. As she stepped back into the cold night, her thoughts swirled with uncertainty. Who was Raphael? Why had he taken an interest in her story? Yet amid her doubts, she couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was significant, a pivotal moment she couldn't yet understand. The next morning, Clara found herself standing in front of an unassuming building in a part of town she rarely visited. The address on the napkin matched the sign above the door, which read Community Development Center. Inside, Raphael was waiting, a quiet determination in his eyes. He led her through the modest space, explaining its purpose, to support small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs like her. This place runs on the idea that the most impactful ventures don't always start with large amounts of money, he said. Sometimes all it takes is the right mindset and a willingness to adapt. Clara felt a flicker of hope. For the first time in months, she wasn't focused on what she lacked. Instead, she began to wonder what she could do with the little she had. As Raphael handed her a folder filled with resources and contacts, Clara felt the stirrings of something she hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. But just as quickly, her practical side returned. How could she afford to take risks when every dollar she earned was already stretched thin? Raphael seemed to sense her hesitation. "You don't have to decide now," he said. "Just think about it. Opportunities like this don't come around often." Later that night, as Clara sat in her cramped apartment, the folder spread out before her, she felt the weight of the decision ahead. The road Raphael offered wasn't guaranteed, and the odds still felt insurmountable. But something inside her whispered that this might be the chance she'd been waiting for. The quiet hum of the city outside her window seemed to echo her thoughts. What would it take for someone like her to rise above the circumstances she had been dealt? And what was Raphael's true role in all of this? The questions lingered as Clara made a silent promise to herself. No matter what came next, she wouldn't let fear hold her back. The morning was colder than usual, a crisp wind biting at Clara's face as she walked through the city streets. In her hands, she clutched a small binder, a mix of notes, sketches, and numbers she had stayed up late finalizing. It was the skeleton of her business plan, a fragile idea she hoped to flesh out into something real. The folder Raphael had given her lay in her bag, its contents both intimidating and strangely exhilarating. Her destination was a community market she had scouted weeks ago. It was nothing glamorous, just a cluster of pop-up stalls and food carts nestled in an empty lot. But it buzzed with energy and potential. Clara had spent hours the previous night calculating costs and sketching out designs, working with the singular focus of someone trying to outrun their doubts. The figures didn't add up neatly, but she was learning to see past the barriers. Money was still a problem. Her finances stretched thin, but Raphael's encouragement had planted a seed she couldn't ignore. At the edge of the market, Clara stopped in front of a food truck, its cheerful colors and enticing aroma drawing her in. The owner, a woman in her 40s with a warm smile, greeted her with practiced ease. Clara ordered a small meal, her limited budget forcing her to choose the cheapest item on the menu. As she ate, she watched the ebb and flow of customers, noting their habits and preferences. Every detail seemed like a clue, a piece of the puzzle she was trying to solve. "First time here?" the owner asked, wiping her hands on a towel. Clara nodded, hesitating before adding, "I'm thinking about starting something similar." The woman raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "It's hard work, but it's worth it if you have a good plan. Do you know what you'd sell?" "Not exactly," Clara admitted, glancing down at her meal. "Something affordable, maybe. Something that makes people feel at home." The woman smiled knowingly. "That's a good start. Just remember, business isn't just about money, it's about connection. If you can connect with people, the finances usually take care of themselves." Her words stayed with Clara as she left the market. Back in her apartment, she spread out her notes on the tiny kitchen table, revisiting every detail of her plan. Hours passed as she worked through her concept, her focus sharpening with each new idea. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, she had a rough sketch of what her venture could look like, a food truck that brought warmth and comfort to communities like hers, places where a simple meal could brighten someone's day. But the question of funding remained. She had no savings to speak of, and the banks would laugh her out the door if she tried for a loan. Clara thought of Raphael's words about persistence, about adapting. Her mind raced as she considered her options, her thoughts circling back to one possibility, crowdfunding. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. If she could tell her story in the right way, maybe she could raise enough to take the first step. The next day, Clara met Raphael at the development center. She presented her plan to him, her voice steady despite the nerves that churned in her stomach. He listened intently, nodding occasionally but offering no immediate feedback. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's ambitious," he said finally, "but it's grounded. I think it could work." Clara felt a rush of relief, tempered by the weight of what lay ahead. Raphael offered to connect her with a few contacts who had experience with crowdfunding campaigns. He also suggested she refine her pitch, focusing on the human aspect of her story. The struggles, the dreams, the resilience. "People connect with people," he said. "Your story is what will make this work." Over the next week, Clara threw herself into the project with single-minded determination. She worked late into the night crafting her pitch, weaving her personal journey into the narrative. She recorded a short video in her apartment, her voice trembling but sincere as she explained her vision. It wasn't polished, but it was real, and that, she hoped, would be enough. When the campaign went live, Clara held her breath. The first few days were slow, each small donation a flicker of hope that barely kept her doubts at bay. But then something shifted. A local journalist stumbled across her story and shared it on social media, praising her determination and vision. The post went viral, and suddenly, Clara's campaign was flooded with support. Donations poured in, along with messages of encouragement from strangers who saw a bit of themselves in her story. As the campaign gained momentum, Clara felt a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. For so long, her world had been defined by scarcity, by the constant struggle to make ends meet. Now, she was experiencing a new kind of abundance, not just in money, but in faith. Faith from people who believed in her, even when she had doubted herself. But success brought new challenges. As the donations grew, so did the pressure to deliver. Clara began to feel the weight of expectations, the fear of letting down the people who had placed their trust in her. And beneath it all, a nagging question lingered. Why was Raphael so invested in her success? His support had been unwavering, yet his motivations remained unclear. Clara didn't have time to dwell on it. The first milestone of her campaign was fast approaching, and she had to prove she was worthy of the faith others had placed in her. The stakes had never been higher, but for the first time in her life, Clara felt like she was moving toward something real, something she could call her own. The sound of her mother's soft cough echoed through the small apartment as Clara sat at the kitchen table, her head resting in her hands. The crowdfunding campaign had brought in enough to cover the cost of a used food truck, but the real work was just beginning. Every decision felt monumental. What to cook, where to park, how to market her business. It wasn't just about creating something functional. It was about building something that could thrive. And for someone like her, there was no room for error. Clara's mother shuffled into the kitchen, her frail frame leaning heavily on the doorframe. "You've been working non-stop," she said gently. "You need to rest." "I can't," Clara replied, her voice tight. "This has to work, Mom. If it doesn't, I don't know what I'll do." Her mother moved closer, placing a trembling hand on her shoulder. "You'll find a way. You always do." The words were meant to comfort, but they only deepened Clara's sense of urgency. She didn't just want to succeed, she needed to. This wasn't just a dream, it was survival. The weight of her mother's medical expenses and the growing cost of supplies pressed down on her like an invisible vice. The reality of her finances loomed large, a constant reminder of how precarious her position was. 2 days later, Clara found herself standing in front of the food truck for the first time. It wasn't much to look at, a dented second-hand vehicle with peeling paint and a faint smell of grease, but to her it was a symbol of hope. Raphael had arranged for her to meet with a local mechanic who specialized in retrofitting food trucks, and as they walked through the details of the renovation, Clara couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement. For the first time, her dream felt tangible, as though it had taken on a life of its own. But as the days turned into weeks, the challenges began to mount. The cost of repairs quickly exceeded her initial budget, forcing Clara to make difficult choices. She scaled back her menu, opting for simple, comforting dishes that could be made affordably. She spent hours researching suppliers, negotiating for discounts, and stretching every dollar to its limit. Every decision felt like a gamble, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. It was during one of these late-night sessions that Clara received an unexpected call. The voice on the other end introduced himself as James Carter, a businessman who had been part of the mentorship panel that had dismissed her weeks ago. His tone was smooth, almost too polished, as he explained that he had seen her campaign and was impressed by her progress. "I believe in second chances," he said, "and I think your idea has potential. I'd like to discuss an investment opportunity." Clara's heart raced as she listened, her mind torn between excitement and suspicion. This was the same man who had humiliated her, who had called her ideas unrealistic and unworthy of his time. Now he was offering his support. But why? Was it genuine, or was there an ulterior motive? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his offer than he was letting on. When she brought it up to Raphael the next day, his reaction was immediate. "Be careful," he warned. "People like James don't change overnight. If he's reaching out now, it's because he sees something he can gain from it." "But what if he's serious?" Clara countered. "What if this is my chance to finally get ahead?" Raphael's expression softened, but his eyes remained guarded. "Just promise me you'll think it through. You've worked too hard to let someone else take control of your vision." Clara nodded, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. That night, as she lay awake in bed, her mind churned with conflicting thoughts. James's offer could solve so many of her problems, but at what cost? And why had Raphael reacted so strongly? There was a tension in his voice that she couldn't quite place, as though he were hiding something. The next morning, Clara made a decision. She would meet with James, but on her terms. She chose a neutral location, a bustling cafe downtown, where she could maintain control of the conversation. As she sat across from him, watching his perfectly rehearsed smile, Clara felt a surge of determination. This time, she wouldn't be intimidated. James wasted no time getting to the point. He offered her a substantial investment in exchange for a percentage of her business. His words were smooth, persuasive, but Clara couldn't ignore the way he emphasized control. He spoke of streamlining operations and maximizing profit margins, terms that felt cold and impersonal compared to her vision of community and connection. "Your concept is promising," he said, leaning forward, "but you need someone with experience to help you take it to the next level. This isn't just about money, it's about building a legacy." Clara hesitated, her mind racing. The idea of having financial security was tempting, almost irresistible. But the more she listened, the more she realized that James's vision for her business wasn't hers. He saw it as a commodity, a means to an end, and that wasn't what Clara wanted. "I appreciate the offer," she said finally, her voice steady, "but I need to do this my way." James's smile faltered, just for a moment, before he regained his composure. "Fair enough," he said, though there was a sharpness in his tone that hadn't been there before. As he left the cafe, Clara felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had stood her ground, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last she would hear from him. Back at the food truck, Clara threw herself into the work. There was no time to dwell on doubts or second-guess her decisions. The launch was approaching, and every detail had to be perfect. As she adjusted the menu board, a strange sense of calm settled over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt certain of one thing. This dream was hers, and she wouldn't let anyone take it away. But as Clara stepped back to admire her work, she caught a glimpse of Raphael standing across the street, his expression unreadable. There was something in his posture, a tension that made her chest tighten. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was keeping something from her, something that could change everything. The early morning sun cast a golden glow over the city, bathing Clara's food truck in soft light as she prepared for her first day of business. The truck had been parked in a busy neighborhood square, strategically chosen for its mix of locals and commuters. Clara had spent countless hours rehearsing every detail, how to greet customers, the rhythm of preparing orders, the speed of transactions. But now, standing inside the truck, her nerves threatened to unravel her carefully crafted plans. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the menu board, the words scrawled in neat chalk letters, "Comfort food with heart." It was a simple slogan, but it carried the weight of her vision. Clara wanted her food to be more than sustenance. She wanted it to feel like a piece of home, a small refuge in the chaos of the city. The first customer arrived just as the clock struck 7, a man in a crisp suit, clearly in a hurry. Clara greeted him with a practiced smile, taking his order and working swiftly to prepare it. As she handed him the neatly wrapped sandwich, she caught a glimpse of something she hadn't expected: genuine appreciation. The man's hurried expression softened as he took the food, offering a quiet thank you before hurrying off. It was a small moment, but it filled Clara with a quiet sense of pride. By mid-morning, the line had grown, stretching across the square. Word of the new food truck seemed to have spread quickly, and Clara found herself caught in a whirlwind of activity. Each order was a small victory, each satisfied customer a reminder of why she had fought so hard to make this dream a reality. But the day wasn't without its challenges. Supplies ran low faster than expected, forcing Clara to improvise with the ingredients she had left. The heat inside the truck was relentless, and her body ached from the constant movement. Yet despite the physical exhaustion, Clara felt alive in a way she hadn't in years. She was building something real, something hers. As the lunch rush began to wane, Clara took a moment to step outside and catch her breath. She leaned against the truck, sipping water and watching the steady flow of people passing through the square. It was then that she noticed a familiar figure in the crowd: James Carter. He stood at a distance, his sharp suit and polished demeanor standing out against the casual chaos of the square. His presence felt deliberate, a silent reminder that he hadn't forgotten her rejection. Clara's chest tightened, but she forced herself to stay composed. She refused to let him intimidate her. Not here, not now. Turning her attention back to the truck, she pushed the encounter from her mind and focused on the remaining customers. That evening, as Clara closed up shop, Raphael arrived unannounced. He leaned casually against the truck, his expression unreadable as he watched her clean up. There was a tension between them, unspoken but palpable, and Clara felt it weigh heavily in the silence. "You did good today," he said finally, his voice low and even. "Thanks," Clara replied, her tone guarded. "But I'm guessing you didn't come here just to say that." Raphael hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "I saw Carter earlier." Clara stiffened, her hands stilling on the countertop. "So did I. He didn't approach me, though." "He's not the type to give up easily," Raphael said. "Be careful. He has a way of making people think he's helping them when he's really just helping himself." There was something in Raphael's tone, an edge that made Clara's stomach churn. She turned to face him, crossing her arms. "Why do you care so much? What aren't you telling me?" Raphael looked away, his jaw tightening. For a moment, Clara thought he might walk away, but then he sighed and leaned against the truck. "I've dealt with people like him before. They use money and influence to control everything and everyone around them. I've seen what happens when people fall into their trap." His words hung heavy in the air, a warning laced with something deeper. Clara wanted to press him for more, to understand why this seemed so personal to him, but Raphael changed the subject before she could. He pulled a small envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. "What's this?" she asked, her brow furrowing. "An invitation," he said. There's a local entrepreneur networking event tomorrow. It's a good opportunity to make connections, but just be cautious. Not everyone there will have your best interests at heart. Clara nodded slowly, tucking the envelope into her bag. She didn't trust easily, but Raphael's concern seemed genuine. Still, the secrets he held nagged at her, an unresolved tension that made her question his motives. That night, as she lay in bed, Clara's thoughts churned with uncertainty. The success of her first day had given her a taste of what was possible, but it also underscored how fragile her position was. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something monumental, something that could either elevate her dreams or shatter them entirely. And then there was Raphael. His support had been invaluable, but his cryptic warnings and guarded demeanor left her questioning what role he truly played in her journey. Was he a friend, a mentor, or something else entirely? As the city outside her window settled into a quiet hum, Clara made a silent vow to herself. She would keep pushing forward, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. But she couldn't ignore the shadows that seemed to grow darker with every step she took. The soft hum of chatter filled the elegant room as Clara stepped into the networking event, her unease masked by a carefully composed expression. The venue was a stark contrast to the modest beginnings of her food truck. A grand ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors. The crowd was a blend of seasoned entrepreneurs, eager newcomers, and opportunistic investors, each conversation layered with ambition and intent. Clara adjusted her simple blazer, feeling out of place among the tailored suits and designer dresses, but she reminded herself why she was here. This was an opportunity to make connections, to find allies who might help her grow her business. She couldn't afford to let her insecurities show. As she moved through the room, engaging in polite conversation and exchanging business cards, Clara couldn't shake the sense of being watched. The sensation grew stronger as the evening progressed, and when she turned toward the far corner of the room, her suspicion was confirmed. James Carter stood there, a glass of champagne in hand, his eyes fixed on her with a predatory intensity. Clara's chest tightened, but she refused to let him rattle her. Instead, she turned her back to him and struck up a conversation with a woman running a small organic farm. They discussed potential collaborations, the synergy between fresh produce and comfort food, sparking genuine excitement. But even as Clara focused on the conversation, she felt James's presence like a shadow in the room, a constant reminder of the power dynamics at play. It wasn't long before James made his move. He approached her as she stood by the refreshment table, his smile as polished as the room around them. "Clara," he said smoothly, "I must say I'm impressed. You've made quite the splash with your food truck." Clara turned to face him, her expression neutral. "Thank you. It's been a lot of hard work." "Hard work and vision," James replied, his tone almost patronizing. "It's rare to see someone turn an idea into a reality so quickly. I hope you'll reconsider my offer." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "I appreciate the interest, but my answer hasn't changed." James's smile didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something darker in his eyes. "Ambition is a powerful thing, Clara. Just be careful not to let pride get in the way of progress." The veiled threat lingered in the air as James walked away, leaving Clara with a knot of unease in her stomach. She turned back to the room, scanning the crowd for Raphael. He had promised to attend the event, but he was nowhere to be seen. Clara couldn't help but feel his absence keenly, especially in a space that felt more like a battlefield than a gathering of equals. Later that night, as Clara stood in the lobby waiting for her cab, Raphael finally appeared. His face was tense, his usual calm replaced by a quiet urgency. "I saw Carter approach you," he said without preamble. "What did he say?" "Nothing I haven't heard before," Clara replied. "He's persistent, I'll give him that." Raphael's jaw tightened. He's not just persistent, he's calculating. If he can't win you over, he'll find another way to get what he wants. Clara frowned, her frustration bubbling to the surface. Why do you care so much? You keep warning me about him, but you won't tell me why. What's your connection to all of this? Raphael hesitated, his expression conflicted. For a moment, it seemed as though he might finally reveal the truth, but then he shook his head. This isn't the time, he said quietly. Just promise me you'll be careful. Clara's anger flared, but she held it in check. She knew Raphael's advice came from a place of concern, but his refusal to share the full story left her feeling isolated. I don't need your protection, she said, her voice firm. I can handle this. Raphael nodded, though his eyes remained shadowed with worry. I hope you're right, he said, because Carter doesn't play fair. The cab ride home was silent, but Clara's mind was anything but. The evening had left her with more questions than answers, her instincts screaming that the dynamics at play were far more complicated than she understood. The interactions with James and Raphael felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't yet see clearly, each one hinting at something larger and more dangerous. When she arrived at her apartment, Clara found a small package waiting for her on the doorstep. There was no note, just a plain box wrapped in brown paper. She carried it inside, her curiosity tinged with unease. As she opened it, her breath caught. Inside was a pristine ledger, its pages filled with detailed accounts of financial transactions. At first glance, it seemed innocuous, just numbers and entries. But as Clara flipped through the pages, a chilling realization set in. These weren't just any transactions. They were records of bribes, money laundering, and illegal deals involving some of the city's most powerful players. And one name appeared again and again, James Carter. Clara's hands trembled as she closed the ledger, her heart pounding in her chest. Someone had sent this to her, but why? Was it a warning? A call to action? And most importantly, who could she trust with this information? As the night deepened, Clara sat alone in her dimly lit apartment, the weight of the ledger pressing down on her like a storm cloud. The stakes had never been higher, and for the first time, she began to understand the true scope of the battle she was facing. This wasn't just about her food truck anymore. It was about power, corruption, and the price of standing up to forces far greater than herself. But Clara wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. Not ever. The morning air was crisp, biting against Clara's cheeks as she stood in the shadow of her food truck. The ledger sat in her bag, a heavy reminder of the storm she'd unwittingly stepped into. Sleep had eluded her, the details of the transactions etched into her mind like a sinister map. Every page had told a story of greed and exploitation, with James Carter's name glaring at her like a taunt. The question that haunted her now was simple, yet devastating. What was she supposed to do with it? As customers began to arrive, Clara forced herself into the rhythm of her work. The comforting smell of sizzling ingredients filled the air, and for a few moments, the mundane tasks of preparing orders and greeting customers provided a reprieve from her racing thoughts. Yet, even as she smiled and chatted, she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. By mid-afternoon, Raphael appeared. His presence had become a constant in her life, though their dynamic felt more strained with each passing encounter. Today, his expression was particularly grim, his jaw set in a way that told Clara he wasn't here just to check on her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. Clara glanced around at the thinning crowd, then nodded. She led him to the small seating area behind the truck, where they could speak without prying ears. "I got something last night," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She pulled the ledger from her bag, handing it to Raphael. "This was left on my doorstep." Raphael's face darkened as he flipped through the pages. His fingers lingered on certain entries, his eyes narrowing with recognition. When he finally closed the book, his expression was a mix of anger and fear. "This is bad," he said, his tone heavy. "If Carter finds out you have this—" "I know," Clara interrupted, "but I can't just ignore it. This isn't just about me anymore. People are getting hurt because of him." Raphael hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "You're right, but this isn't something you can handle alone. You need to be strategic, careful." "Then help me," Clara said, her voice firm. "You've been warning me about him for weeks. Tell me what you know." For a long moment, Raphael said nothing. His jaw worked as though he were weighing his words, debating how much to reveal. Finally, he spoke. "Carter ruined my family," he said quietly. "My father was a small business owner, just like you. Carter offered him an investment, made it sound like a dream come true, but it wasn't a partnership. It was a trap. My father lost everything, and when he tried to fight back, Carter made sure he couldn't. Legal threats, financial sabotage. He destroyed us." Clara's breath caught as the pieces began to fall into place. Raphael's anger, his protectiveness, his insistence that she be cautious. It all made sense now. "And now you're trying to stop him," she said softly. Raphael nodded. "But it's not easy. People like Carter have resources, connections. They operate in the shadows, and they're ruthless with anyone who tries to expose them." Clara's grip tightened on the edge of her seat. "Then why send me this?" she asked, gesturing to the ledger. "Why involve me at all?" "That's the question," Raphael said, his expression grim. "Whoever gave you this knows it's dangerous. Either they think you can handle it, or they're using you as a pawn." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. Clara had fought so hard to build something of her own, to create a life defined by hope and possibility. But now it felt like her dreams were slipping through her fingers, replaced by a battle she hadn't asked for. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Raphael's gaze hardened. "We take this to someone who can do something about it. But we need to be smart. If Carter gets wind of this before we're ready, he'll bury it, and us, before we have a chance." That night, Clara and Raphael worked late into the evening, strategizing their next move. They compiled the most damning pieces of evidence from the ledger, cross-referencing them with public records and news articles to build a clear picture of Carter's corruption. It was meticulous, exhausting work, but Clara felt a strange sense of purpose as they pieced everything together. This wasn't just about protecting her business anymore. It was about justice, about standing up to the forces that sought to crush people like her. But as the hours ticked by, Clara couldn't ignore the gnawing fear in the back of her mind. She was stepping into dangerous territory, going up against a man who had built an empire on manipulation and deceit. The stakes had never been higher, and the margin for error had never been smaller. When they finally finished, Raphael looked at her, his expression both resolute and weary. "We need to move fast," he said. "The longer we wait, the riskier this gets." Clara nodded, her determination outweighing her fear. "Then let's do it." As she closed the ledger and placed it back in her bag, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows outside her window seemed to shift, the quiet hum of the city feeling almost too still. She told herself it was just paranoia, but the unease lingered, a silent warning that the battle ahead would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The tension in the air was palpable as Clara and Raphael entered the small office tucked away in the heart of the city. It was an unassuming space, the kind that blended into its surroundings, but Clara could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. They had arranged to meet a journalist Raphael trusted, someone with a reputation for exposing corruption at the highest levels. This was their chance to bring the truth to light, but it was also their riskiest move yet. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn, sat behind a cluttered desk, her expression equal parts curiosity and skepticism. Clara placed the ledger on the table, her hands steady despite the storm raging inside her. Evelyn flipped through the pages, her face growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is explosive," Evelyn said finally, her voice low. "If this is authentic, it's not just Carter. There are connections here to major players, politicians, corporations, even law enforcement. You realize the kind of heat this could bring down?" Clara nodded, her resolve unwavering. "That's why we're here. People like Carter have been getting away with this for too long. It's time someone held them accountable." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her sharp gaze fixed on Clara. "You're brave," she said. "But bravery won't mean much if you're not prepared for what comes next. People will come after you for this, legally, financially, even physically." "I'm not backing down," Clara said firmly. "If we don't do this, nothing will change." Raphael, who had been silent until now, added, "We're ready. Just tell us what we need to do." Evelyn nodded, pulling out a small recorder. "Let's start with your story," she said. "The ledger is compelling, but people need to see the human side of this. They need to understand why it matters." As Clara recounted her journey, the struggles, the rejection, the relentless fight to build something from nothing, she felt a strange mix of vulnerability and strength. She spoke of her mother's illness, the food truck, and the constant battle to stay afloat. By the time she finished, Evelyn's expression had softened, her journalistic detachment replaced by a glimmer of respect. "You're exactly the kind of person they don't want to succeed," Evelyn said. "And that's why your story matters." The interview lasted hours, Evelyn meticulously documenting every detail while Raphael worked alongside her to cross-check the information in the ledger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Clara felt the first stirrings of hope. They were building something powerful, something that could shine a light on the darkness Carter and his allies had hidden in for so long. But as the trio wrapped up their session, a sudden noise outside the office shattered the calm. A loud bang, followed by hurried footsteps, sent a jolt of adrenaline through Clara's veins. Raphael moved quickly to the window, his expression darkening as he peered outside. "We've been followed," he said, his voice low but urgent. "There's a black car parked across the street. It's the same one I saw near your apartment last night." Evelyn's face tightened. "You need to leave. Now." Without hesitation, Clara and Raphael gathered their things. Evelyn handed them a USB drive containing a backup of the documents they had compiled. "Take this," she said. "If something happens to me, make sure this gets out." Clara's chest tightened, the weight of the drive in her hand feeling heavier than it should. She nodded, her gratitude unspoken but understood. Moments later, she and Raphael slipped out the back entrance, the cold night air stinging against their skin. The city seemed quieter than usual as they made their way back to Clara's apartment, taking a circuitous route to avoid being followed. The unease from earlier had grown into a full-blown sense of dread, each shadow on the street feeling like a potential threat. When they finally arrived, Clara locked the door behind them, her hands trembling. Raphael paced the small living room, his frustration evident. "They know we have something," he said. "We need to act fast before they make their move." Clara sat on the edge of the couch, her mind racing. "What do we do? If we release this, they'll come after us even harder." "Which is exactly why we have to do it," Raphael said, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "The only way to protect ourselves is to make it impossible for them to silence us. Once this is public, they lose their leverage." The determination in his voice bolstered Clara's resolve. She nodded, her fear giving way to a fierce sense of purpose. "Then let's do it." Over the next several hours, they worked tirelessly to upload the documents and the interview to multiple secure servers. Evelyn had given them contacts at several major media outlets, and they sent the files to each one, ensuring the information couldn't be suppressed. By the time they finished, the first light of dawn was breaking over the city. Clara stood by the window, watching the sun rise with a mix of exhaustion and anticipation. They had taken the first step, but the battle was far from over. Behind her, Raphael spoke softly. "You've come a long way, Clara. No matter what happens next, you should be proud." Clara turned to him, her expression resolute. "This isn't just about me anymore. It's about everyone who's been hurt by people like Carter, and I'm not stopping until they face the consequences." The city below began to stir, its familiar hum returning as people started their day. But for Clara, everything had changed. She had stepped into a fight far bigger than herself, and there was no turning back. The morning headlines hit like a thunderclap. Clara's story, along with the damning contents of the ledger, dominated every major news outlet. The corruption scandal rippled through the city like a shockwave, exposing a tangled web of bribes, illegal contracts, and shadowy alliances. Names that once carried untouchable reputations were now splashed across screens and newspapers, their secrets laid bare for the world to see. Among them, James Carter stood at the center, a symbol of unchecked greed. Clara sat in her apartment, her laptop open to a live news broadcast. The journalist on screen detailed the findings with surgical precision, her voice a mixture of outrage and determination. Clara's heart pounded as she watched the story unfold, each revelation striking like a hammer. They had done it. The truth was out. But the victory was short-lived. A loud knock at the door shattered her focus, and she froze. Raphael, who had been pacing the room, exchanged a sharp look with her. Without a word, he moved to the window, peeking through the blinds. "It's the police," he said quietly. "Plain clothes. They're here for you." Clara's stomach churned. "Why? We haven't done anything wrong." "That doesn't matter," Raphael replied. "Carter's people will use whatever means they can to discredit you. They'll claim you stole the ledger, that you're fabricating evidence. It's all about controlling the narrative." The knocks grew louder, more insistent. Clara's pulse raced as she grabbed the USB drive containing the files, tucking it into a hidden pocket of her bag. "What do we do?" she whispered. Raphael gestured toward the fire escape. "We leave. Now." The two moved quickly, slipping out the back window and descending into the alley below. The city greeted them with its usual bustle, oblivious to the chaos that had erupted behind closed doors. Clara clutched her bag tightly, every step feeling like a gamble. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "Where do we go?" Clara asked as they merged into the crowd. "To someone who can protect you," Raphael said. "I have a contact, a lawyer who's worked with whistleblowers before. She'll know what to do." The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Angela, greeted them with a mix of skepticism and urgency. Her office was modest but efficient, the walls lined with books and case files. Clara explained everything, her discovery of the ledger, the threats from Carter, and the police at her door. Angela listened intently, her sharp eyes taking in every detail. "You're in deep," Angela said when Clara finished. "But you've done the right thing. The media exposure complicates things for Carter and his allies. They can't silence you without making it obvious. That's your leverage." Clara nodded, though the weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest. "What do I do now?" Angela leaned forward, her voice firm. "You stay visible. The more public you are, the harder it is for them to make you disappear. I'll handle the legal side, but you need to keep telling your story. Keep the focus on what matters." It was sound advice, but the idea of stepping further into the spotlight terrified Clara. She had fought so hard to escape the shadows of her struggles, and now she was thrust into a battle that felt larger than life. Yet as she looked at Raphael and Angela, she realized she wasn't alone. They believed in her just as she had come to believe in herself. Over the next few days, Clara threw herself into the fight with renewed determination. She appeared on talk shows, gave interviews, and met with community leaders to rally support. Her food truck became a symbol of resilience, a gathering place where people came to share their own stories of struggle and triumph. Every conversation, every interaction, reminded Clara why she had started this journey in the first place. But the threats persisted. Anonymous messages, shadowy figures lingering near her truck, whispers of lawsuits designed to bankrupt her. Clara knew Carter's reach was vast, his power undeniable. Yet with every attempt to silence her, she grew more resolute. She had come too far to back down now. One evening, as Clara closed up her truck, Raphael approached her with a grim expression. "There's something you need to see," he said, handing her a tablet. On the screen was a leaked email chain, the contents chilling in their implications. It detailed a coordinated effort by Carter's team to frame Clara for fraud, painting her as a desperate opportunist who had falsified the ledger to gain attention. "They're escalating," Raphael said. "They know they're losing control." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "Then we hit back harder." That night, Clara and Raphael worked tirelessly to compile a rebuttal, a comprehensive timeline of events supported by witnesses and additional documents. They released it to the press the following morning, dismantling Carter's smear campaign before it could take root. The public response was swift and furious, further isolating Carter as his allies began to distance themselves. But Clara knew the battle wasn't over. Carter was cornered, and cornered men were dangerous. She couldn't predict his next move, but she could feel the tension building, a storm gathering on the horizon. Every step forward felt like walking a tightrope, the ground below threatening to give way. As the city buzzed with the fallout from the revelations, Clara stood on the edge of her food truck, staring out at the bustling square. The people who passed by were strangers, yet their faces held a sense of recognition, a quiet solidarity. Clara had become more than a business owner. She was a symbol of what could be achieved with determination and courage. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the square, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was still to come. Somewhere in the distance, she knew Carter was planning his next move, and she needed to be ready. The night was still, the kind of quiet that made every sound feel sharper, every shadow seem deeper. Clara sat in the small office above her food truck, staring at the screen of her laptop. The latest updates on the scandal filled her inbox. Articles, legal documents, and messages of support from strangers. Her journey had become a beacon for people who had faced similar struggles, but it had also drawn the ire of powerful enemies. The weight of it all pressed on her, but she refused to crumble. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a message from Raphael. "It's happening tonight. Be ready." Clara's heart raced. She knew what he meant. The final move. The showdown she had anticipated but dreaded. For weeks, they had played a dangerous game of cat and mouse with James Carter and his allies, exposing truths while dodging threats. Now, it seemed, Carter was ready to strike back. The message included an address, a high-rise building downtown. It was Carter's headquarters, the heart of his operations. Raphael had uncovered a crucial piece of evidence hidden there. Something that could bring the entire house of cards tumbling down. But retrieving it meant walking directly into the lion's den. Clara stood, slipping the USB drive into her bag along with her phone. She took one last look around her office, the walls lined with plans and photographs of her food truck's beginnings. It was a testament to how far she'd come, a reminder of the fight that had brought her here. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the night. The city seemed unnaturally quiet as she approached the building, Raphael waiting for her in a nearby alley. He handed her a small earpiece, his expression grim but resolute. "We get in, we get the files, and we get out," he said. "Quick and clean." Clara nodded, though her nerves felt like a live wire. The two entered the building through a side entrance, the silence inside almost deafening. Every step echoed in the empty hallways as they made their way to the top floor. Raphael had memorized the layout, leading Clara to a secure office where the files were stored. But as they entered, a figure stepped out of the shadows. James Carter stood before them, his polished demeanor replaced with cold fury. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long," he said, his voice low and menacing, "but this ends now." Clara's pulse pounded in her ears as Carter's men appeared behind him, blocking the exits. For a moment, the air felt suffocating, the odds insurmountable. But then Clara remembered why she was here, why she had started this fight in the first place. She met Carter's gaze, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her. "You can't bury the truth forever." Carter smirked, his confidence unshaken. "The truth doesn't matter if no one's left to tell it." But before Carter could give the order, the sound of sirens filled the air. The room froze as red and blue lights flashed through the windows. Moments later, law enforcement stormed the building, their weapons drawn. Clara and Raphael raised their hands, relief washing over them as Evelyn appeared behind the officers. "You didn't think we'd let you do this alone, did you?" Evelyn said, a sly grin on her face. Carter's composure cracked as the officers moved in, arresting him and his men. The files Clara and Raphael had come to retrieve were seized as evidence, adding to the mountain of proof against Carter. The once untouchable businessman was led away in handcuffs, his empire crumbling under the weight of his crimes. As the chaos subsided, Clara stepped outside, the cool night air filling her lungs. The city stretched before her, alive with possibility. She had faced her fears, stood her ground, and emerged stronger for it. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Clara's story dominated headlines, her bravery inspiring a wave of support from communities across the city. Her food truck became a symbol of hope, attracting lines of customers eager to be part of her journey. She expanded her business, partnering with local farms and charities to create a network of support for small entrepreneurs. One evening, as Clara served her last customer of the day, she paused to reflect. The fight had been grueling, the challenges relentless, but she had proven something powerful, that even the smallest voices could make a difference. To everyone watching, let me ask you this. What would you do if you had to stand up against impossible odds? Would you fight, or would you let fear hold you back? Clara's story reminds us that courage can come from the most unexpected places. If you've been inspired by her journey, let us know in the comments. And if you believe in stories that challenge and uplift, don't forget to like and subscribe for more. As Clara looked out at the bustling square, a smile touched her lips. This was only the beginning. The empire she had built wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who had believed in her, who had fought alongside her, and for the first time, she felt truly unstoppable.